There is a belief among Islamic scholars that the Abrahamic covenant, fulfilled through Ishmael instead of Isaac, entails the promise of the land from the Nile River to the great river of Euphrates, along with the blessing to all nations through Abraham's seed. Those who hold this view argue that God asked Abraham to offer Ishmael, not Isaac. They also contend that the ancient Israelite scribes altered their scriptures. In contrast, the Israelites are bound by the Sinai covenant, which highlights communal responsibilities and accountability to God and to each other as part of the agreement between God and the Israelites. What is the articulation of their argument? The argument that the Abrahamic covenant is fulfilled through Ishmael rather than Isaac involves several key points articulated by those who support this view. Here is a summary and analysis of their arguments. 1. Promise of the land. Proponents of this view argue that the promise of the land extending from the Nile River to the Euphrates, as mentioned in Genesis 15 verse 18, was intended for the descendants of Ishmael. They believe that this geographic expanse aligns with the territories historically associated with Islam and Muhammad, who was a descendant of Ishmael. 2. Blessing to all nations. They interpret the promise of blessings to all nations through Abraham's seed, Genesis 12 verse 3 and Genesis 22 verse 18, as being fulfilled through Muhammad, Surah 21 verse 107, which reads, "And we have not sent you, O Muhammad, but as a mercy for the unto all beings." They argue that Islam, preached by Muhammad, has had a significant historical and cultural impact on a global scale, thus fulfilling the promise of being a blessing to all nations. 3. Sacrifice of Ishmael. This argument hinges on the belief that God asked Abraham to offer Ishmael as a sacrifice, rather than Isaac. This is primarily based on Islamic tradition found in the Quran, Surah 37, verses 99 to 113, which states that Abraham was asked to sacrifice his son, and many Muslims believe this son was Ishmael. They argue that this narrative was the original one, which was later altered by Israelite scribes to place Isaac in the position of the sacrificial son. 4. Scriptural alterations. Supporters of this view contend that ancient Israelite scribes altered the scriptures to reflect Isaac as the chosen son who was to be sacrificed and through whom the covenant would be fulfilled. They believe that these alterations were made to establish and legitimize the Israelite claim to the covenantal promises. Sinai covenant context. The Sinai covenant, distinct from the Abrahamic covenant, focuses on the relationship between God and the Israelites, emphasizing communal responsibilities and accountability. This covenant, given at Mount Sinai, includes the 10 Commandments and a detailed code of laws that govern the moral, religious, and social conduct of the Israelite community. The Sinai covenant underscores the idea that the Israelites are to be a holy nation and a kingdom of priests, dedicated to serving God and adhering to His commandments. Articulation of their argument. Those who argue for the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant through Ishmael articulate their position by highlighting these key points. 1. Historical and geographic claims. They argue that the promise of the land and blessings align more closely with the historical and geographic realities of Ishmael's descendants rather than those of Isaac. 2. Islamic tradition. They cite Islamic scripture and tradition, which they believe preserves the original account of the sacrifice involving Ishmael rather than Isaac. This account is viewed as being more authentic and less altered than the Hebrew Bible's version. 3. Critical view of Scripture. They take a critical view of the Hebrew Bible, suggesting that it underwent alterations by Israelite scribes to support their theological and political claims. They argue that these changes were made to establish a narrative that centers on Isaac and his descendants as the primary inheritors of God's covenant with Abraham. 4. Fulfillment through Ishmael's lineage. They believe that the widespread influence and significance of Ishmael's descendants fulfill the covenantal promises more broadly and inclusively, aligning with the idea of being a blessing to all nations. In conclusion, the perspective that the Abrahamic covenant is fulfilled through Ishmael rather than Isaac is grounded in scriptural interpretations, historical context, and theological viewpoints. This contrasts with the traditional understanding of the covenant associated with Isaac and highlights significant differences between the Abrahamic and Sinai covenants.